Welcome to Burma Votes 2010, a series of vodcasts and podcasts brought to you from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific in Canberra. My name's Nicholas Farrelly. This has been a simply historic past week in Burma's political life. Aung San Suu Kyi was released and a wave of elation and euphoria reverberated around the world. It was pretty hard not to get excited about what her release might mean for the future of that country. Today I'm going to be joined by Trevor Wilson, a former Australian ambassador to Burma who's been on the ground during the recent election. He'll be sharing with us his thoughts on what he thinks the election means and what might happen now that Aung San Suu Kyi has been let free. We'll also be hearing from Anwar Ibrahim, Malaysia's opposition leader, who was here on campus earlier in the week and who also shared his thoughts about what Aung San Suu Kyi's release might mean. If you'd like to join in the conversation with us, you can do so at New Mandala, where things on the Burma front have been quite boisterous recently, or of course you can leave comments for us at the ANU YouTube channel. Our guest today is Trevor Wilson. Trevor is a former Australian ambassador to Burma and retired from our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2003. He's currently a visiting fellow in the Department of Political and Social Change, which is part of the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. Trevor, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to have you involved in this series for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, you've just returned from Burma. You were there to pay close attention to what was going on with the 7 November election. Can you tell us something more about what you were doing and where you went?
Well, I went at this time, the end of October, and then through into November, just to refresh my knowledge of the situation there. After I'd made my arrangements to visit, the date of the elections was announced, and so I knew that I would have the good fortune to be there when the elections were on, but I wasn't in any official capacity at all, just purely as a private researcher, and I was very careful not to misrepresent my position there. But I talked to as many contacts as I could, including a few candidates for the elections, some political commentators, various international organisation representatives, and a few government people. So I got a fairly wide cross-section of views in the interviews that I had, but it was really quite interesting to see the election developing, in a campaign of sorts, under very heavy controls, of course, from censorship and in turn, nothing like the saturation of the media that you get in Australia. But it was an election campaign. Then voting day itself was interesting. I was actually up in Calais on the border between the Burman heartland and Chin State, because I sort of knew some people there, and I went to voting stations in Calais completely unannounced, just to see what was going on, and it was well worth being there.
As you know, in recent weeks it's often been repeated that this was the first opportunity for the Burmese people to have a vote in 20 years. Was this election what you'd expected?
The election was never really expected by anybody to be a free and fair election in a democratic sense of the word, and an election that would result in transfer of power to a different kind of government. Everybody knew beforehand that it was a very controlled election process, that the regime was managing this for a certain outcome, which was to keep them in power, but in a slightly different format, in a slightly different colour, getting rid of the green and replacing it with civilian clothes. But it was interesting when I got there to hear the predictions of some of the electoral pundits there, who were making a very wide range of predictions, most of which didn't come true. whereas the prediction that the government party would win a pretty well overwhelming majority because they were the only party that had candidates in all the seats, that expectation turned out to be true. What the generals actually wanted of this is not entirely clear. I mean, obviously they wanted some kind of endorsement of their continuation in government and the elevation of their party to a fully operating political party. But what else they wanted is not clear. What they now have, of course, is a situation where they've actually got anti-government parties elected, with candidates elected to the different assemblies, not in large numbers, of course, really quite small numbers, small parties, who will be part of the political process when these assemblies meet in 90 days' time. These candidates will now have a role to play. Now that's really quite new for Burma. So, and they haven't had this kind of thing for 40 years. How the military leadership is going to manage all of this is also really quite unclear at the moment. How frequently the assemblies will meet, whether they will have a real role or whether they'll be just doing the rubber stamp job. How legislation or proposals are initiated from outside the government. And these candidates, believe me, think that they're going to be doing this. So there's a certain amount of political space that has been created there that I hadn't actually expected to see with my own eyes, and is not going to disappear entirely, even if the censorship is restored and everything is very controlled.
The chorus of Western derision about these elections was widespread. Trevor, do you think there are any reasons that we should be slightly more positive?
I think the elections, the fact that there were elections and the result, even if it's in the government party's favour, has produced a rather different political dynamic. And certainly the people quite enjoyed, not just the candidates, but the people at large seem to quite enjoy having preparations for election, candidates and advertising trucks running around the streets with posters and slogans and loudspeakers. And there's been more airing of issues, more thinking about, things that haven't been given attention by the government and that ought to be given attention by the government. And although there's an enormous amount of mistrust on the part of the people and lack of confidence that the election's going to result in any dramatic improvement, I think there's a rather surprising sense that it is a new game to a certain extent, even if many of the familiar military faces are still around. And I think this has also been capped off by the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi was released, apparently to be completely free. And she is still a very important player in the political process, and as she's made it clear, she intends to remain so. So I think if you put all of that together, we're in a different sort of period. And I wouldn't say I'm terribly optimistic, but I'm hopeful that maybe some good will come out of this. But it's going to require a lot of self-control and discipline by all sides. And unfortunately, if you sort of think about what's happened in the past and the number of false starts there have been and the number of cases where everything sort of just collapsed in a heap, you'd have to think that, is this going to be any better or any different? Can they really do it when probably no side has got a completely good record in terms of being very accommodating and accepting compromises, making concessions and working for some grander purpose.
Trevor, you've suggested that there could be opportunities in Burmese politics to somehow now move forward. Of course, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from her most recent period of house arrest this past weekend. What was your reaction to that turn of events?
Well, I was delighted, along with everybody else in the country at the time, and people around the world. Her release unconditionally in complete freedom is a tremendous development, and something that people, of course, have been waiting for a long time. And it was quite astonishing, although not surprising, to see the mobs of Burmese people, coming out quite spontaneously to greet her and welcome her, because she does offer them the only source of hope and inspiration. It's a question now of exactly how she's going to operate, whether she has some kind of understanding with the generals about what she can and can't do, and what they should and should not do with her, including they should offer her, guarantee of security, because that is a question. If she can find a role for herself, given that she's not has any formal status whatsoever, she's not the leader of a party because the party is no longer a legal organisation. She herself refers to herself as the leader of a movement, which is an interesting concept, but that's not written down in the Burmese constitution. So how the generals are going to tolerate what she does remains to be seen. But they do seem to be in a mindset of allowing her a certain latitude. I think that this is something that we ought to welcome, encourage, be supportive of, but we have to bear in mind that although she's the focus of all of this attention, she's not the only participant in the political process. Other things go on. She and her movement will be able to do certain things, and certain things they may do very well, brilliantly, that have not been done by anybody else before. But there are a lot of things that she's not in a position to do, not being the leader of the government and not being the leader of a solidly organised national-wide organisation any longer. The grassroots are still there, the supporters are still there, but the organisation of it is not what it was before. So how this is all going to translate and play itself out, and whether this can be done peacefully, there will be a few setbacks, but as long as these are not major setbacks, it could be manageable, and we could move forward, as they say.
Earlier in the week, Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim was here on the Australian National University campus. Some people have tended to draw parallels between Anwar's experiences in Malaysia and some of the things that Aung San Suu Kyi has gone through in Burma. Both are often held up as political prisoners. Anwar, while he was here, managed to sneak in some comments about the situation in Burma, and I think it would be interesting, Trevor, if we just had a quick look at those now.
Well, exhilarating news. We've been looking forward for her release for some time now, but this euphoria must have its limits. We are not sure exactly the conditions imposed, whether the march of democracy would continue. This is not Aung San Suu Kyi personal agenda. This is an issue for the Burmese people, and I would certainly support her program for reform, for democracy in Burma. Well, we welcome that, because I think the position she takes is, of course, very consistent with ours. She must be prepared to negotiate with all forces, and there's no question of denying that. But the agenda should be clear. It should not be an attempt to frustrate her efforts or use the negotiations to deter the movement for reform.
So Trevor, that's what Anwar Ibrahim had to say about Aung San Suu Kyi's release, and in fact he's suggesting that she'll have a number of very real challenges to face. If you were in a position to offer advice and counsel to Aung San Suu Kyi, what would you suggest that she tries to do?
Well, I don't think that she needs my advice or counsel, or anybody's for that matter. She has a very clear sense of her political role in Burma. And she's already made it clear how she initially intends to move forward. She knows that she needs to reach out to people to hear what they want, what they are expecting of her. And she knows that because she's been out of contact for such a long time, that she needs to do quite a bit of groundwork, preparation before she makes definitive statements about things. That makes a lot of sense. I think a politician anywhere would do that sort of thing. I think that we, and perhaps she, needs to be a little bit realistic about what she's going to be able to achieve, because a lot of this is going to depend on the mood of the generals, the military leadership. They don't like, they're not used to negotiating, they don't like having a mediator, they're not used to making concessions, they're used to getting everything their own way. How receptive are they going to be to people like her, putting forward proposals absolutely genuinely, not for any self-interest? Will they be able to take these on board? Will they sit down and actually work out some kind of genuine pathway towards reconciliation? Because that's the big thing that's missing at the moment. If she can move in those sorts of directions, as well as in areas of socio-economic reform, which is where other people say there's a lot of work that needs to be done, that would be excellent.
One of the issues that I'd imagine pretty much every single future Burmese government is going to have to deal with is the various claims of the ethnic minority populations. Just as this election was being held, of course, we all learned that there was renewed fighting in parts of the Karen state, and since then there have been reports of hostilities in the Shan state as well. Trevor, what do you make of this resumption of ethnic conflict in this post-election moment?
Well, the unresolved issues that still persist along the ethnic minority areas in the border regions are amongst the most difficult challenges that any new government there faces. There were ceasefires which worked for quite a while and brought some benefits for the ethnic minority groups, but they've never been translated into anything more enduring or more complete. So that is a very serious challenge, and if it cannot be met and dealt with, I would expect that there would be ongoing tensions along the borders, that there would continue to be problems from time to time, and that these sort of problems will only be exacerbated and not rectified by the use of force. I don't think China is at all interested in that kind of solution for these sort of problems. I don't think that the fact that some of these ethnic areas were actually excluded from the election because of the security situation in these areas was a good sign. It's a sign that how poorly integrated the whole state is at the moment, and how much unfinished business there is. So they need to be able to get onto dealing with some of the problems with the ethnic minority groups in a serious way. Otherwise, the whole election outcome could be jeopardised.
Trevor, do you think that Aung San Suu Kyi would stand a better chance of working out some kind of long-lasting deal with the ethnic minorities?
Intuitively, it sounds as if that's an area where she might have a role to play, but the practical problem is that she actually doesn't have a great deal of personal first-hand knowledge of the ethnic areas or a lot of relationships with their leaders. This is an area where she hasn't been in the past able to play much of a role, to get out there and go into these sort of areas and engage in discussions with the people there to find out what their expectations and wishes are. But on the other hand, the military regime has done such a bad job of negotiating with these people that any kind of help, whether or not you would call it mediation or just a contribution to finding a final solution, would be a very welcome thing, and it may well be that she can play a role there, because most of the ethnic minority groups are prepared to allow her a role. They recognise and respect her. Some of them are a little bit cautious about saying that they will follow her leadership because they've got their own interests and their own areas that they've been running and managing and dealing with for a very long time. But I don't think any of them would have any objection whatsoever to her playing the role of a peacemaker, if you like.
Finally, Trevor, and this is my last question, I promise. With Aung San Suu Kyi now released, what can countries like Australia do to improve circumstances for the people of Burma?
Good question. The international community really has a lot of work that it can do to be supportive of opening up in Burma and hopefully a trend towards gradual democratisation, if that's what really happens. But there's a lot of preparation that needs to be done in terms of capacity building, strengthening civil society, and improving people's livelihoods so that they're just in a better position to exercise reasonable choices when the time comes. And Australia has a good Burma policy at the moment which allows it to do all of those sorts of things. The one thing that it seems we're not looking at, because Aung San Suu Kyi herself has said she wants to revisit, is the question of sanctions. Now, I don't think that this is going to mean that sanctions are suddenly lifted, or that she suggests the sanctions should be lifted immediately, because nothing has improved that dramatically yet. She's probably going to be saying this is not the time for more sanctions because they've already had some undesirable effects on ordinary people, whether that was intended or not. So I think that she is probably going to look for ways in which she can find opportunities for the international community to be a bit more supportive than they have in the past of this process of slow change in Burma. My own view is that one of the things that could be done early on is for international financial institution sanctions to be lifted, because they're not in legislation in any particular country. It's a veto by the United States in the boards of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, etc. I think if some gesture becomes appropriate in terms of response to what the military regime has genuinely done in terms of changing or improving their behaviour, that kind of relaxation of international sanctions might be in order. But we have to wait and see. This is clearly not going to happen very quickly. And indeed, sometimes it's going to be difficult to even decide whether anything has improved or not, or whether it's going to revert to some of the bad conditions that we've seen in the past.
Trevor, we really appreciate that you took the time to come in and talk to us today. Thanks very much for being involved.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode of the Burma Votes 2010 vodcast and podcast series. With Aung San Suu Kyi now out from house arrest and with an opportunity for the first time in a long while to speak her mind and to tell us what she thinks about the future of Burma, I think it's important that we pay close attention and that we do our best to understand what her release will mean for the future of the country. If you'd like to join in the conversation with us, you can do so at New Mandala, or of course you can leave comments at the ANU YouTube channel. Until we meet again, best wishes to all.